So we're going to kind of rattle through this because we've packed in quite a lot to this morning already. But this passage, as you can see, brings us to the point of just before the crucifixion, which we'll be thinking about, obviously, as the week progresses. So just to backtrack a little bit, we left Jesus being mocked by the guards, if you remember, in our reading last week, and they blindfolded Jesus. And they were mocking him, saying, "Go and prophesy, who's hit you?" So they've got this blindfold on him, and they're sort of spinning him round and beating him with a stick, and then saying, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And the reason why they did that was because there's in Isaiah 11, there's a prophetic verse about the Messiah. It said he will judge not by what he sees or by what he hears. So there was a traditional sort of thought then that somehow the Messiah would judge by smell. Of course, if you read Isaiah 11, you'll find he judges by righteousness and in the power of his spirit. But this was the kind of the folky, superstitious thing. So they were doing that. They were saying, well, if you're really the Messiah, you don't need to see us or even hear us. You just judge. So that's what they were doing. It's just mocking going on with Jesus. So where we picked up our reading, which Lorna brought for us first, at daybreak, the Council of the Elders, this is the Sanhedrin, only was allowed to meet during the day. So they wanted to make the best use of the day. So right at the start of the day, as soon as they could, they had Jesus dragged before them. So this was the 70 of the greatest and the good. The religious teachers would sit there in a semicircle with Jesus, the accused, standing in front of them. And then behind him, there'd be like students and rabbis. And they would gather around and bring the accusations against Jesus. And of course, the thing that they were accusing him of, ironically, and here's deep irony here, isn't it, was blasphemy, which to them was a capital crime. But of course, they were doing the very same thing because they were accusing the Son of God of being, well, just a charlatan or troublemaker. They were committing blasphemy. This is the painful irony in all this. But that was what they accused Jesus of. And of course, they get exactly what they wanted. They have in this very short conversation, if you're the Messiah, tell us. And he says, if I tell you, you won't believe me. But he says, do you know what? And this is Jesus's faith, isn't it? What he's been going through, he's been beaten, mocked, he's hauled before the court, he's been rejected by everybody, and he's totally confident in his Father. He says, from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. He knows that God is faithful. He knows that God is going to come through. He knows that despite the circumstances, despite how things are looking, God is in this with him. He knows that. And of course, they've got what they want. They think, there he is, bang to rights. Now, the way that Sanhedrin was set up was actually deliberately to be able to offer mercy. So in other words, if you were going to accuse someone of being guilty, you had to get a majority of 2, whereas to be not guilty only needed a majority of 1. And also, they weren't allowed to pass sentence the same day. They had to reflect on the decision, so that if overnight they changed their mind, and they could only change their mind from guilty to not guilty, they couldn't change it the other way. Yeah, so it had kind of like safety elements built in to make sure they didn't make unjust judgments. But they kind of threw all that out of the window because all they wanted was Jesus dead and gone. But blasphemy was a capital crime for the Jews. For the Romans, it wasn't. And the Jews had no authority to have Jesus killed for his blasphemy. They had to go to the Romans to get them to approve it. And for the Romans, blasphemy, well, that was just superstition. That's just the Jews' religious nonsense. They weren't interested in that. They're just getting upset over nothing. So they had to come up with something else. So you notice the charge that the religious leaders gave to Jesus was this terrible irony, blasphemy. But the charge that they took to Pilate was 3 things, nothing to do with blasphemy at all. They were all false. They were, here we are, verse 2, subverting the nation, opposes payment of taxes, tax evasion, and claims to be the king. Okay, he didn't do any of those things. Okay, King Herod, he didn't claim to be the next king for King Herod. He claimed to be much bigger than that. He was the Messiah. He was the Savior. He was the King of Kings. But he wasn't trying to depose Herod. He wasn't telling people that they shouldn't pay taxes. And he wasn't trying to create a riot. In fact, he was doing the very opposite of all those things. So here he comes, perfectly innocent against all of these false charges that the religious people, here's the irony again, it's religious people who want Jesus dead. Yeah, it's no wonder people are a bit iffy about religious people, You've got reason to be. Here they are in the Bible, they're doing it again. So they come before Pilate. So Pilate is the Roman appointed governor. He's based in Caesarea, but like everybody else, everybody's up to Jerusalem. So they drag him before Pilate and they come up with these three charges. They must have been discussing it, thinking, what's really going to get Pilate excited? He's going to be worried about riots because that's no good for his reputation. The Romans hate that. They want peace. They don't want riots. So he's going to have an interest in that. His taxes, yeah, he'll be upset about that as well. And the king, which was appointed by Rome, of course, King Herod, well, if he's threatening treason, then that's got to be, we've got him on three. Yeah, so Pilate could pick one of those, that's enough. So they've got him on three here. But here we have, in our passage this morning, three trials, two with Pilate and one with Herod. And guess what? Jesus is found innocent at all three. So Pilate announced to the chief priest, he says, I find no basis for a charge against this man. So it's clear as day to Pilate. He doesn't need to spend hours thinking over this. He doesn't need a night to reflect on it. It's clear to him that this is the Jewish religious leaders. For some reason, they've got something against this bloke, but there's nothing in law. I find no reason. It'd have been very easy for Pilate to take that on and say, okay, well, if he's telling people not to pay the taxes, if he's trying to spark rebellion, then yeah, I agree with you. We want him out of the way. It would have been a whole lot easier for Pilate to have gone with the priests and said yes, but he didn't. He says, no, there's no truth in this. But they insisted, and they start again. And they say, this man, he started in Galilee and he's come all this way and he's still building up this rebellion. So Pilate sees a chance to get out of this tricky situation. He hears that Jesus is from Galilee and he thinks, well, actually, okay, this isn't my jurisdiction, actually. It's Herod's. This is Herod's problem. And here's the even better news. Herod is in Jerusalem as well because it's Passover. So I don't need, we can sort this out really quickly. Take him to Herod. He's Herod's problem, not mine. Thanks very much. So he goes to Herod. What happens? This is Herod who had Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, beheaded. Yeah. When he was entertained by a dancing girl and offered her half his kingdom. And the girl went to her mum and said, what should I do? And the mum says, ask him for John's head. And he gave it to her. This is the kind of man we're dealing with. So, but Herod, he just doesn't see Jesus as a serious figure at all. He wants to be amused by him. He wants to be entertained by him. Show us some miracles. We might see some of these things I've been hearing about. But Jesus didn't answer him. Jesus had nothing to say to him. Isn't that a terrible thing? When you've reached the point in life when actually God hasn't got anything to say to you anymore. That was where Herod was. He'd pushed God so far out of his life. And you think the encounters that he'd had, the opportunities that he'd had, he knew all about Jesus. He heard the reputation. That's why he was excited to see him. He'd had John the Baptist in front of him and slaughtered him. God had no more words for Herod. That is a terrible, dark place to be. Now, the very fact that you're here means that that's not you. But for some, they've pushed God so far away that really God's got nothing more to say. And that's the experience, that's the place that Herod had reached in his life. And so he just sees Jesus as this figure to make fun of, not serious at all. They dress him up in this ironic, elaborate robe. And even then, Herod, he can't find anything wrong with Jesus. It would have been so easy for him to do it. He could have gone along with it, kept the religious leaders on side. That's great politically to do, isn't it? No one would have cared. They've come up with the appropriate charge. It's treason, absolutely. As king, yeah, off with his head. But he didn't. So even then, even in the spiritual darkness that Herod was living in, such that God had no words for him, even Herod, confronted by Jesus, could see that he was innocent. So he comes back to Pilate. Now, Pilate has got some form. Before 1961, there was actually no physical evidence that anyone called Pontius Pilate existed. People used to say, oh, it's just part of the Bible story, it's just stories all made up. And there were writers at the time, historical writers, who had drawn on the information from the Bible, but the Bible was the only source of any belief that there was a bloke called Pontius Pilate. Then in 1961 in Caesarea, where he was in charge, they found a stone with his name inscripted on it, Pontius Pilatus. It was on a set of steps. It was removed from its original building, and it now was on a set of steps in a theatre. There it was, in 1961. And it's just by the by, there's never been an archaeological discovery that has disproved anything in the Bible. Archaeological discoveries have only ever proved the Bible was right. And for things that people had denied for ages because there was no evidence, well, now they've found evidence, and that's just one of them, that Pilate was a real man. He existed at that time, and he was in Caesarea. He was a man of authority. So there you go. 1961 took all that time, but now we know for sure. We can point to the proof, and that stone is I think there's a replica in a museum in Italy, but it's also in a museum in Israel. So anyway, he comes back to Pilate. Pilate is getting worried. By now, his wife has told him, because she's had this dream. We read in one of the other Gospels that she's had this dream, and she goes to Pilate and says, "Have nothing to do with this man. Just don't go there." Okay, she's spooked by this because she has some inkling of who Jesus is, because God has been speaking to Pilate's wife. Now, Pilate's job was at stake. He made a real mess of a situation before. When the Roman soldiers went from Caesarea into Jerusalem, the Roman soldiers used to carry an image of the emperor on the top of their standards. And the Jews hated that because it was a graven image of a god. So in the past, previous governors had told the soldiers to take the little bust thing off the standards when they went into Jerusalem, so they didn't offend the religious leaders. There was no skin off their nose, so that's what they did. But Pilate, oh no, Pilate left them on. So they went in there, marching into Jerusalem with these standards, with the bust of their god, the emperor, on, and the Jews didn't like it at all. And there was this huge standoff where Pilate threatened to kill them, and they said fine, and actually lied down on the ground. This dispute went on for 6 days. They just said, okay, come and kill us, because we would rather lose our lives than blaspheme against our God. So this was a really bad situation, and Pilate had to back down. But Rome hated that because of Pax Romana. This is what they wanted. They thought the Roman Empire spread peace. So any governor that created insurrection was doing a bad thing. So he was already on one warning. The last thing he wanted was another insurrection, because that would get back to Rome and he would lose his job. So the religious leaders are blackmailing Pilate here. Yeah. And so what Pilate does is, in the end, his decision around Jesus is based on convenience and not conviction. He couldn't risk losing his job in order to do what he knew was right, because he'd examined Jesus. He'd done it twice now, and both times he knew that Jesus was innocent. Can you imagine standing in front of your Creator with the power to end his human life, and knowing that he was innocent, and yet still saying, no, my job is more important. My security is more important. And people do that now. God is speaking to people now. He taps them on the shoulder. He sometimes takes them to their darkest fear, like we had on that song with Ellie Holcomb. He takes them to the end of that road in order to show them. And people will still stare into his face and say, no, I want this. I'll have this instead. Some people, like Herod, will stare into his face and say, it's just a joke. Nothing more than a swear word. What's Jesus to you this Easter, I wonder? What does his sacrifice mean to you? Have we got so used to it, actually, that we can kind of read these things and, yeah, we know how it goes? Have we got so used to singing the songs and here in the readings. Maybe like as Charlie Mackesy prayed earlier, that we just ask God to allow it to penetrate our hearts once more and show us the reality, the wonder of what he's done for us. Let's not treat him casually. Let's not treat him as something unimportant or irrelevant or someone that we can put off for now until later in life when I've got these things out of the way. Let's not look at him and turn away and say, actually, you're important, but you're not as important as what I want. Because the wonder is that Jesus died for Pilate. Jesus died for Herod. Jesus died for those religious leaders who came with trumped up charges. Jesus died for everyone that's failed him. Jesus died for all those people who had been cheering him Palm Sunday and then spat at him a week later. Can you imagine doing that? We'd want vengeance, wouldn't we? We love just desserts being served. Jesus doesn't. Jesus doesn't serve just desserts. And the most amazing thing is he eats the just desserts for us. And that's what he did on the cross. And that's why we can come. That's why we can stand. It's why I can stand in a holy place where we know God is worshipped and not be struck down, because he has mercy. There is nothing that we have done, no goodness in us, that qualifies us for God's love. We receive God's love because he chooses to love us, just as he loved Herod, Pilate, and everyone else. And it's our decision this Easter, as it always is, and for many, many others. And let's pray that others will come to this point of decision through Alpha, through Easter, through all the things that are going on, to choose him, to choose life, to choose hope.